You're listening to another episode of the Ana Vivo podcast. Thank you for your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode here on the Ana Vivo podcast. I'm your host, Tim C. Miller, and we are doing a special standout episode for you all. I know usually they come out Monday mornings, weekly, bright and early in the morning, live from beautiful Whidbey Island, Washington. But today I'm joined by co-host and progenitor, my father. Is that the right word? Progenesis? What? My patriarch, my...
I'm daddy. I'm papa.
That's okay. Okay, that's better. Yeah. I'm joined by Clay Miller, my father, on air. We're going to do a special episode today on a unique listing that he has. If you don't know, my father was instrumental in getting me into real estate. He's been doing this for 20 plus years.
21 plus years.
21 plus years now.
22.
Works for a lovely brokerage here on the island, Windermere Real Estate, and has been doing listings, helping buyers and sellers all across the island and elsewhere for, two plus decades now. And he's got this awesome listing that's back on the market that he represented clients before as well on the same listing. And it's just a really neat historical piece. Why we're doing this episode is because of the history specific to Whidbey Island on this actual property. And so there's no one better to describe this and to bring on board to talk about this than my own father, historian, local, and amateur botanist, Dad. So Dad, welcome to the show.
Thanks. This is a privilege to be here and to talk about something other than my accident.
Yes. Yeah, I think that was the last time we had you on the episode. Was that it? The ATV accidents was the last time you recorded?
That was it. And that was a long time ago. It was another life.
Another life. And now you're healed, praise the Lord.
Yes.
And so is Mom, and you're back to work as ever before. And you'd like to share with us some cool part of history. So let me just set the scene. This property, Whidbey Island, is about an hour long, 10 minutes wide, off the coast of Washington State, and sits in the Puget Sound here. One of the largest islands in the United States. And during World War I and World War II, they used the western coast as they built it up and fortified it with some forts that are now state parks, along with forts across the water there to defend against what they thought would be potentially a Japanese invasion into Bremerton and Seattle area. And our island sort of is that defensive point. And north of us is the greater San Juan Islands and Canada, Vancouver and Victoria. South of us is the southwest of us is the Olympic Peninsula and the beautiful Olympic Mountain Range. And east of us is the Cascade Mountain Range, which runs from Canada down to Mexico. And so a lot of cool history here. And I'll let Dad talk more about that. And then Coupeville, the center, almost basically the center of our island here, is one of the oldest towns in the state as well, and was founded a long time ago, and lots of neat history from that as well. And so all of this ties together into this particular property that Dad has now back on the market, and that his clients have just done a great job restoring and working through. And so without further ado, take it away.
Oh, thanks. So just real quick background on the Miller family. My dad, Bill Miller, got orders to Whidbey Island in 1962 with the Navy. He was an enlisted airplane mechanic, and he brought my mom and I, was just two, brought us here. And we lived in Navy housing for about a year, and then eventually they bought a house that was built in Seattle in the early 30s. And when they built the Space Needle, they needed to get Canadians down to see the Space Needle, and Highway 99 wasn't cutting it. So they needed to extend I-5 north from what we would call Lake Union all the way up to Canada, to Vancouver. And as they punched through, they were destroying neighborhoods to make way for the interstate. If you can imagine being on I-5 and looking due east at the Husky Stadium, that was part of I think the Queen Anne District or University District, and there were a bunch of houses there, and they were leveling. They were buying them by eminent domain, and they were leveling these houses. And an interesting sailor from Texas who had gotten out of the Navy named Lloyd Patton went down there and bought 20 homes for $1 a piece, and he moved them 2 at a time down to the water's edge, got them on a barge, and brought them up to where Hasty Lake Road hits Puget Sound. Mm. He built a ramp, and then he bought what's the area called Patton's Hideaway, and he put these houses up there. My parents bought one of those for $12,500, and today Tim's brother Seth and his wife Becky live in that house. So there's a lot of history in Whidbey Island, and the Millers have been here for 61 years. And in my career in real estate, every once in a while we come across a property that has a story. And in my 21 plus years of real estate, this property has the most colorful story of anything I've sold, and I've sold about 500 properties. And this one I get to sell twice. I sold it about 2.5 years ago for a client, and it was in pretty rough condition. And the newest owners, the Olson family, bought it, and they've done a wonderful job of restoring the property, and now they're ready for somebody else to take it. So, little background history on the Whidbey Island, if you're not from this area, that I think was kind of helped set the story. Of course, the first people that were here were the Native Americans. And on Whidbey Island, specifically, as Tim said, it's a long island. It's about 145 miles of coastland. And it takes about an hour to drive from the south end to the north end in a car today. It's the third largest island in the lower 48. And our island used to be inhabited by 3 tribes. 2 predominantly. In the north end, it was the Skagit tribe, and on the south end, it was the Snohomish tribe. And there was a little portion of what today is called Fort Eby State Park that was inhabited by the Kalalam tribe, which I think their main residence, their center of their tribe was over in the Olympic Peninsula. So the area where this house was part of the Skagit tribe originally. And they had 3 villages. One was located where Monroe Landing hits Penn Cove today. That's where one of their tribes was. Their villages was. And there was another one up in Oak Harbor, where the city of Oak Harbor is, and another one in Crescent Harbor, way over by Paulnell Point. So there were 3. And then on the southern end of Penn Cove, there were 2 villages. One is where present-day Coopville is, and one is the town of Coopville, and one is to the east where Snakeland Point is. There. So these were the people that were here first. And then the Spanish came into Puget Sound. It's where we get the name Port Angeles, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, Rosario. There's a lot of Spanish heritage here in this area. And then the English came in, and the first one that came in and really did much was Captain George Vancouver. He was on the HMS Discovery, and he was sent to look for the Northwest Passage.
And this was the late 17?
It was specifically 1792.
Okay, yeah.
So what's interesting is Vancouver and another guy named William Bligh, I believe, were lieutenants on Captain Cook's ship originally. And Captain Cook, the famous English explorer that discovered lots of things. So Vancouver ends up getting his own command, and he's up here in Puget Sound naming everything.
Right.
We've got Lieutenant Baker, Mount Baker, Lieutenant Rainier, Mount Rainier, Peter Puget, Puget Sound. And he goes around Whidbey Island. He names Whidbey Island after his first mate or master, Joseph Whidbey. And when he sails into Penn Cove, he writes in his journal that there are giant trees. I believe he writes that there are deer, elk, and bear. And he finds an Indian village there. and they're amazed when they can't believe his face is white. So he unbuttons his shirt and shows them his chest is white too, and they rub it with their hands as if it were paint, trying to get the paint off, because they'd never seen anybody like that before. But that doesn't happen until 1792. But if we back up the tape to 1637, which is, to put it in perspective, it's 27 years, 17 years after the Pilgrims have landed at Plymouth Colony. 17 years later, the first Libby comes to North America. He comes to North America from an area, it used to be an island in the county of York in England. It'd be southeastern England. I think it's the part that's perhaps closest to France. And today it's not an island because the canal's been filled in, but it was called Thanet or Thanet. I don't know how you say that. Thanet. And this guy's name is John Libby. He's like Samuel Libby's fifth great grandfather. He comes to the area that we know today as Maine or Nova Scotia. Back then it was called Arcadia, and it was a French colony. And Acadia, it was a French colony. And that's where the Libbys come to North America. And then 5 generations later, after America's become its own country, there's this thing called this exodus of people trying to get to the West Coast. And it's kind of a race between the Americans and the British. And the British are coming down into northwestern America through Canada, and a lot of it's the Hudson Bay Trading Post, which was Fort Vancouver, down at present-day Vancouver, Washington. And there was kind of like, there were things going on, like you can read about the Pigs War on San Juan Island, which used to be called Bellevue Island. There was some like kind of a tug of war going back and forth between the United States.
Skirmishes going on.
Yep. So the American government was interested in populating Americans out here to sort of, possession is 9/10 of the law. So to get more Americans out here than British citizens. So they came up with this thing called the Donation Land Claim Act. And so this happened in 1850. In fact, it happened for about 5 years. And the way it worked was if you were a male and you were a citizen, you had declared that you were going to be a citizen, and you were over the age of 18, and you were in what was called the Oregon Territory, you could be given a half a section of land. Do you know what a section is?
A section of land. You want to give us the dimensions on that?
Yeah, do you remember this from real estate school?
Yeah.
Excuse me.
A little square divided by a bunch of little squares.
Yeah, so a section's easy. It's 1 mile, 1 square mile. So it's a mile on one end and a mile on the other end. It's a square. And inside there were inside a square mile is 640 square acres. So a half a section would be 320 acres. So what they did was the Donation Land Claim Act gave a male who was a citizen or had declared he was going to become a citizen. I guess it could have been like a British or a Canadian or even a Native American who said, I wanted to become an American citizen in the Oregon Territory. They gave him a half a section of land. If they were married, this is important. If they were married, they gave him an additional half section, or they gave him a full section, but it was under his wife's name. This was the first time, I think, in American history where women could hold title to real estate.
Interesting.
Not by themselves, unfortunately, at that time. But they could, if they were married, they would get half of that land in their name. Yep.
What was the year on this Donation Act?
1850 to 1855.
Okay.
Yep. And I think...
So just prior to the Civil War.
Yeah, I don't know, but I think part of this is the genesis of the community property state, where if you're married and you owned property, it's in both of your names. If one of the spouses dies, it stays in the remaining spouse's name. So it was during this time of the Donation Land Claim Act that this guy named Samuel Libby filed a claim. He said, I would like to take advantage of that. And he had come out into the area through what was now present-day Oregon. Back then, it was all part of the Oregon Territory. And he had come up and he was married to Sarah and had 2 boys, but he had left her and the boys somewhere. I don't know where. And he had come up from what is present-day Oregon up to this area, found some land up here on Whidbey Island in what today we call the Plat of Sierra, or the development of Sierra, on the northwest corner of West Beach Road and Libby Road. And he found, I believe it was 301 acres that he liked. He thought it could be good farmland. So he filed a claim. And he wanted to build his house there, but I think it was a few more years before he built his house.
Okay.
So some other things that were kind of going on at that time, or just prior to that, to sort of, kind of, if I could give a little bit more color to the story there. In 1792, we talked about George Vancouver sailing through and mapping out Penn Cove. He was the first one to chart out Penn Cove. He charted the coastland, but he didn't do any depth sounding. So he did go around Puget Sound, and he named like 600 places in Puget Sound that still are named today. When he came there, he estimated there were about 600 Indians living on Whidbey Island. He was here in about the summer of 1792. The next big event that we know of happens in 1840. There was a British Jesuit priest named Father Blanchett, who was born in 1795. And now, remember, America's a country now. It's since 1776. He was born in 1795 in Canada somewhere. He'll eventually die in 1883. But in 1840, what would that be? 45 years old, he comes to Whidbey Island. Again, this is not United States of America at this point. It's the Oregon Territory, and it's disputed land between between Britain and America. And he comes to Whidbey Island on the invitation of a local chief. And there they build a chapel. He builds a chapel. He has a rough altar that he's made. And these Indians have already been, they've already been educated by another Catholic somewhere because they know hymns and they know some of the stories from the Bible. And Blanchett was famous for making this thing called the Catholic ladder. It was like a board. I don't remember. I think it was like 6 feet long and 1.5 feet wide. And it basically told the story from Adam and Eve all the way to Jesus. And it was using pictures. Huh. And he would erect this thing, he would hang it up there, and he would point to it, and he would teach the Indians the stories from the Bible.
Cool.
Eventually, though, he builds a chapel there with a cross. And that cross, a portion of that cross, can be seen by the blockhouse next to the Coupeville Museum, the Island County Historical Museum in downtown Coupeville, near the corner of Coveland and Front Street. You can, or I don't know, the vertical street there, the North and South Street is. There's a portion of that cross, the thing that was remaining from that cross is there. And he is reaching out to the Indians, and so the Catholic mission is there. In the next year, in 1841, the first American comes to Whidbey Island, and this is Charles Wilkes, Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, U.S. Navy. Wilkes was to the Navy what Lewis and Clark were to the Army. So Lewis and Clark were sent out in the early 1800s to navigate all the way across to the West Coast and to chart that area and come back and report to the president. Wilkes is sent out with 6 ships from the East Coast. He goes around the world for 4 years. And during his 4-year expedition, which was called the United States Exploring Expedition, or they shortened it to USXX, EXEX. And during that time, he discovers everything. This guy is he's the most unsung hero, in American history. He's responsible for proving the existence of Antarctica, for example. Everybody knew there was a continent there, but nobody proved it because all they'd ever seen was ice. He was the first person to find rocks.
Nice.
He also visits Hawaii a couple times. He climbs up on Mauna Loa and does experiments in gravitation up there. He sails. He makes charts. He was a navigator and he was a cartographer. So he makes charts of all these islands and coves and places for ships to anchor. in these charts that were made in the early 1840s, 1838 to 1842, actually, they were ended up being used by the United States Navy in World War II to help fight the Japanese.
Nice.
So when we were going into these islands like Truck Island and stuff like that, they were actually using Wilkes charts.
Wow.
So he comes into Puget Sound, and he's naming stuff also. For example, Holmes Harbor is named after Silas B. Holmes, who was the surgeon on his ship. He was skipper of the USS Vincennes. Little interesting side note: you know where we live, where you grew up, on the corner of Zulster Road and the highway. One of our neighbors who lives in the same neighborhood, Sky Meadows, one of our former neighbors, lived up on Sky Meadows Road, up on a house that kind of was a little higher than our house and kind of looked out over the cove. She was gardening one day. They were weeding and they were removing some old blackberry bushes, and she found a shot put in her.
Some would not touch it as unexploded ordnance, but not her.
She found a shot put, and she sent an email out to all the neighbors and said, "Hey, I was digging up the garden today. I found this shot put." I said, "Give me the dimensions."
Yeah.
And she gave me the dimensions, and it fit perfectly into one of USS Vincennes cannons. Mm-hmm. And it was customary for Wilkes, when he came into an area, to fire the cannon once to kind of alert all the Native Americans, "Hey, we're here, and we would like to trade with you. We need protein," so they would bring him venison and birds and stuff, and then I'm sure they would buy firewood, and then they would ask them for fresh water sources and stuff like that, and they would trade with the local Native Americans. So I believe she found one of Wilkes' cannonballs on her property. So Wilkes is here in 1841, and he charts Penn Cove as well, but this time he does the soundings, and he does it soundings all the way around Whidbey Island. In 1846, 5 years later, the Oregon Treaty establishes the 49th parallel based on Wilkes' suggestion to the president. Hey, a good way of dividing this end of North America, the western end, is using the 49th parallel. Britain can have everything north. We'll take everything south.
And he charted everything but conveniently forgot about Point Roberts.
Yeah. No, it's in there. So Point Roberts is south of the 49th parallel.
Right. He just didn't realize it would cut them all off and give Point Roberts a piece of America now that nobody can get to unless you drive through Canada.
Have you been there?
Yeah. It's pretty hilarious.
Yeah. So the 49th parallel gets established in 1846 through the Oregon Treaty. In 1847, the Catholic mission that Blanchette established in Coupeville or Penn Cove area is abandoned, and the priests are gone because the stuff became turbulent with the local Native Americans. And then in 1848, the next year, the Oregon Territory is officially established. And then we get the donation land claims. The first one in 1850 was the Bounty Land Act. That was where they would give, this is kind of cool, they would give land to people who had served in the military. So those that had participated in the war against Mexico, they gave them 80 or 160 acres. If they had served 4 to 9 months, in the war, if they were a veteran of the war, any war since 1790, under the Bounty Land Act, they were given land to thank them for their service to the military. Kind of like today, if you're a veteran, you go into Applebee's on Veterans Day, you can get a free meal.
Slightly different. But
back then, they would give you acres. So,
well, they still give you the VA home loan. So
yeah, the VA home loan. Yeah, all these. So in 1850, they did the Donation Land Claim Act that we talked about, and that's where Samuel Libby gets his land. But before that, 2 years later, the next prominent person that came to Whidbey Island was a guy named Thomas Coop. Mm-hmm. You know where we get that name?
Interesting.
Coopville. He was born in 1818. He died in 1875. They say he was the only captain to successfully sail a square-rigged ship through
what I've heard, Deception
Pass. Yeah. He settles in what we call Coopville in 1852, named after him, and he claimed his 320 acres, his half section. His wife, Maria, joins him a year later in 1853. Also in 1853, just 3 months before Washington Territory is created, the Oregon legislature creates Island County.
Yeah.
But today, Island County is predominantly made up of Whidbey Island and Camino Island predominantly. But back then, It included San Juan County, Skagit County, Snohomish County, and Whatcom County.
As it should have.
That whole thing was Island County, and the county seat was Coveland. Coveland is what we can see from our house where we live today.
Now,
It's
Coopville, downtown Coopville.
No, Coveland is actually the head of the cove. So
down by where the old courthouse is.
where the old courthouse
on
is.
Madrona. Okay.
Yeah, if you go up the highway and take a left on Madrona Way and you go literally 400 yards, the fourth driveway is the driveway to the old courthouse, which is still there, and there's a giant poplar tree, which we'll come back. We'll talk about that, but
Hangman's Tree.
yeah. So that was the original Island County, and Coveland was the original capital or county seat for that whole area. Let's see,
And that
what
was
else?
established by Oregon before Washington was even a state.
It was established in the Oregon Territory, and then 3 months later they split off. Oregon becomes a state later, and then they split off.
Territory.
Becomes Washington Territory. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of cool history right here is one of the oldest first places in all of Washington.
Yeah. Yep. So
And so many people don't even know about Whidbey Island. They don't, where? Where do you live? Seattle? Nope. It's Whidbey Island. It's a lot of history.
yeah. So back to the Libbies, because that's where we're really talking about the old Libby.
And why
Libbey
are we
Ranch,
talking about Libby's?
Because I got their listing.
Yes, and the Libby's is the ranch house that we're talking about back to the property itself.
The ranch house itself, yep. So Samuel Libby gets his donation land claim, and he is going to build his house there. He's married to Sarah. Again, I don't know exactly when he gets the claim where she is. Is she in the Oregon Territory? Is she down in California? Is she on the East Coast? I don't know where she is. But Sarah's maiden name is Barstow.
Okay.
If you're a local, you may know that name. Barstow Point, I think, is what's called that little projection of land where the Captain Whidbey Inn is today. But back then, Samuel Libby's brother-in-law, Sarah's brother, Benjamin Barstow, was a sea captain. He came up to Whidbey Island, and he also claimed some land. Let me look at my little map here.
Old Benjamin Barstow.
B.P. Barstow. He claimed land in today what is called Kennedy's Lagoon, and the Captain Whidbey Inn. And he built a shop or a store there. He had a store, a general store. But Barstow, I don't know what year that was, about 1853. So about 3 years after the donation of land claim, Barstow is on his way down to San Francisco to get some supplies. And on his way back up, the ship sinks and he drowns.
Oh, wow.
So that land that he got, he wills to his sister Sarah, which is Samuel Libby's wife. So Samuel Libby has 301 acres. Barstow has his probably 320 acres of what we call Kennedy's Lagoon. So collectively, Samuel and Sarah Libby, they're one of the biggest landholders on Whidbey Island by 1854 or so.
Wow.
In 1859, 5 years later, Oregon becomes the 33rd state. And it was in this year that Sarah Barstow and their two sons, George and Joseph Libby, joined Samuel Libby, the dad and husband, up on Whidbey Island in 1859.
And that's about when they build the farmhouse?
A year later, in 1860, Samuel he's cutting trees down. They're living in some kind of a cabin or something like that. But in 1860, he begins in earnest to build the house today that is the basis of the old Libbey Ranch House.
Oh, cool.
So this is 1860. So what happens in 1861?
Civil War.
Civil War breaks out on the East Coast. And during the Civil War, it wasn't just a fight between the North and the South. There were a lot of people that used that opportunity to leave. They didn't want to be part of the war. So they actually came out west to places like this to get us to start a new life.
Yeah.
And in 1863, during the war, Washington Territory is the size of it's reduced to the current boundary of Washington State, which does not become a state until 1889. So in 1863, the boundary's there, but it's not a state, it's just a territory.
Yeah.
But 36 years later, in 1889, it becomes the 42nd state. So one more piece of colorful history before we talk about the Libbey Ranch. In 1858, who do you think was president?
Ooh, that's a great question. Who is president?
In 1858,
As a true American, I should know this, but
James Buchanan.
okay.
So prior to him was Franklin Pierce, did 2 terms. Prior to him, it was Millard Fillmore. Prior to him, Zachary Taylor. But in 1858, it's James Buchanan is president from 1857 to 1861. And then Abraham Lincoln takes over after Buchanan.
Okay.
But in 1858, Congress begins building a lighthouse on Smith Island.
Oh.
So the Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard, begins to build a lighthouse out on Smith Island. Smith Island is one of the islands in Island County. In present-day Island County, it's one of the 8 remaining islands. There used to be 9 islands in Island County, present-day Island County, but one of the islands washed away. So over by Mailer's Point, what we call the seaplane base. Off of the southeast corner of the seaplane base, if you look on a chart, you can see the remains of an island, Cathlame Island. It's visible at extreme low tides. You can see a portion of it sticking out of the water, but usually it spends most of its life underwater. But today there's 8 remaining islands. Can you name them?
I cannot. Smith Island, Whidbey Island, Camano Island, Pass Island.
Pass Island in the middle. I think.
Where do we draw the line for Skagit?
Yeah, I think Pass Island is part of Skagit.
Because you're not counting that.
Okay. I'm counting it, but I
not
think
as
it's
part of the.
I think it's part of Skagit County.
Goat Island?
No, that's part of Skagit County too.
Oh man, Skagit gets all the good islands.
So if you go out west of Deception Pass, there's Deception Island.
Deception Island.
I think that's part of Island County. Nobody lives on it. If you go out east of the bridge, there's a little island called Strawberry Island. Nobody lives on that. And then if you go into Cornet Bay, there's an island there called Ben-Ur Island. There's actually people living on that. It's also part of the state park, where there used to be people living on it. Now I think it's state park, and you can go out there and rent a yurt or something and stay out there. And then there's Smith Island off of Joseph Whidbey State Park. Directly west 5 miles is Smith Island. And then Smith Island at low tide is connected to Minor Island. But at high tide, they're separate islands. Minor Island. And then down by in Langley, Freeland area, there's another island that's connected at low tide. But at high tide, it's a separate island called Baby Island.
Oh, right.
So those are the 8 remaining islands of Island County. But going back to 1858, they build the Smith Island Lighthouse out there.
Right. For the Coast Guard.
For the Coast Guard, and it's a lighthouse. It's a house where there's a Coast Guard family living in it, maintaining the light. They're keeping the flame burning. They didn't have electricity back then, so they're keeping the flame burning with oil and the Fresnel lens and all that stuff. And there's a family living out there, and they've got a little farm, chickens and cows, and they collect rainwater. It's a very dry spot that only gets about 10 or 12 inches of rain a year. And it has a family. There's a husband and a wife and children. And these children will one day come over and play with the Libby kids over on the old Libbey Ranch and stuff like that. And so anyway, the lighthouse is built in 1858 and begins to be manned in 1858. But in 1860, 2 years later, Samuel Libby with his wife begin to build their home. He and his sons, they begin to build their home. And they built this house on this 301 or 311 acres, depending on where you read, on what today we call the Platte of Sierra and the old Darst Farm. You know, it's all kind of part of that area there.
And that whole point of Whidbey Island is almost, or basically the westernmost point of the island that juts out towards the Pacific. And so it makes sense that directly off that, 5 miles off that, is Smith Island, where these other kids are playing. But also they can see directly through the channel, through the San Juan, Strait of San Juan out to the Pacific. And you've got, if you're standing at the ranch house, for those of you listening, and you're looking out to sea, on your left, or what would be the south, you see the Olympic mountain range and the strait that, if you were a ship, you would take into the port of Seattle or Bremerton. On your right, you look out and you see Victoria, you see Lopez Island, you see, keep going more north, you can look up towards the rest of the San Juan Islands and Anacortes up there now. But it just, and then Smith Island almost directly out, maybe out towards your right a little bit, but kind of the lay of the land. And then this whole, and it's just very windy because it juts out. All the Pacific storms hit that point, and so you get a lot of the wind and the that would come up through the farmland there, and then it's also a very narrow spit between the Pacific Ocean and Penn Cove, that road that's now called Libby Road. Do you know how long that is? I don't know how long it is. It's not very long, and they were going to dig something.
Yeah, Howard Grasser, who Grassers, he was the grandson of George and Martha Grasser, who settled on the. So another story, but kind of related, to answer that question. There was another donation land claim by a guy named Dr. Lansdale. Dr. Lansdale owned all the area north of Kennedy's Lagoon and basically west of Santa Fuca, and where present-day Sky Meadows development is located, and where the Coveland was and everything.
In the old schoolhouse.
Yep. And Dr. Lansdale owned all this property, but he was from the Bellingham area, not from Whidbey Island. And he actually was like a landholder. He went around and bought land and stuff like that, I think mainly as an investment. He sold his land to a guy named Captain Roeder, Roeder. And Captain Roeder, who was from the Bellingham area. He was important for settling, helping establish Bellingham. And Captain Roeder had this land here, but he wasn't really using it. So he invited his friends from Bellingham, George and Martha Grasser, said, "Why don't you go down and farm my land? You can lease it from me." So they leased it from him for a while. And Captain Roeder allegedly was famous for bringing trees to the Pacific Northwest from, somebody told me that he would go to Boston, he would get trees and bring them back on a ship, potted trees. There's a poplar tree by the old courthouse on Madrona Way. There's a poplar tree on the old Libbey Ranch. And there's an American elm tree on Grasser's Hill. If you are going down Madrona Way, going northbound towards the highway, and you cross the highway immediately straight ahead and to your left a little bit, is a very, very old American elm tree.
Largest elm tree on the island.
Yep. And that supposedly came with Captain Roeder. And Captain Roeder, after he leased the property to George and Martha Grasser, according to this story is from Howard Grasser, he eventually sold it to them. They bought it, and then they raised sheep, and they did some crops, some wheat and things like that. They had a 90-foot hand-dug well.
Wheat.
Yeah.
It sounded like weed. But
weed, yeah, no, not wheat.
Not at that time.
Not weed. Yeah, and they had their farm there, and then they left it to their sons, and then they left it to, eventually they sold it, the second generation Grasser, and I forgot the name. He sold Grasser's Hill to the Penn Cove Associates, which was a group of men from Seattle led by a famous Swedish TV personality and comedian named Stan Borison. And they developed it into a development called Sky Meadows. And Grasser's Lagoon was going to be a marina for the people in Sky Meadows, but the state intervened and said you can't turn that into a marina because it's prime clamming ground. So the Penn Cove Associates sold Grasser's Lagoon to the state. It's now owned by the state. And Grasser's then no longer possess that area, but the elm tree was there from Captain Roeder, who also gave one to Samuel Libby, and he planted that. And today it's next to the tennis court on their property. So we come to 1860. Samuel Libby and his family begin building their home, and they live there until their family owns that property until 1949. So from 1860 until 1949.
So from pre-Civil War to post-World War II.
Till post-World War II. It stays in the Libby family. And during that time, the Libbys become famous for being public servants. So I think he was a treasurer. He was an auditor. I think he and his son, which son was it? Joseph Barstow Libby, Samuel Libby's son. They took turns serving as public servants for the original Island County. There's a famous story where the commissioners or the Island County commissioners are demanding that Samuel Libby bring the county's money as a treasurer, bring the money to them, and he refuses to do it. So they send the sheriff out and they arrest him. And finally he relents, and he has to go find the money. It's been hidden in a tree stump, because back then everything's primitive. They didn't have safes and stuff.
All of Highland County's collected taxes have been hidden in a tree stump.
Yep. And then what's really cool is, so the next family that buys the Libbey Ranch is the Hanson family. The Hansons move there, and somehow they acquire what's called Oceanside Ranch, the Libbey Ranch. They acquire that in 1949. I think her name was Faith Hanson, and she was born in 1922, and she was married to a Navy ensign, John Donnerly, and then he died, and she married another guy named Richard Hanson, and then they moved there, and they raised 7 daughters on this property.
Wow.
And during that time of ownership...
7 brides for 7 brothers style.
Yeah. And during that time of ownership, Mr. Hanson is down in the basement of the old Libby house, working in the basement. Ruth Hanson tells me this story. And he's working on the wall, and he pulls a brick out or something, and this diary falls out. And it's dated 1870.
And this, he finds this mid-1900s, 1950s?
Somewhere after 1949.
Okay.
So he finds this diary. It's dated 1870, and it's written by Joseph Barstow Libby, the son of Samuel Libby. And I've seen a portion of this diary, and in there he talks about riding his horse from where they're home all the way to downtown Coupeville. But he also talks about playing with the kids from Smith Island Lighthouse. They would sail over and they would play with them on their ranch or on the beach or something like that.
Nice.
Which I thought was pretty cool.
Oh, that's neat.
So the Hansons owned the Libbey Ranch from 1949 until I think it was 2021. And that's when Ruth Hanson comes to me, and people have not lived there now for a couple of years. It's been not abandoned, but it's been it's been vacated for about 2 years. And she says the family needs to sell it, and so we get it listed, and it's in beautiful but rough condition.
Okay.
So it needs a lot of work because it's a really, really old property. In fact, this is one of the oldest structures in Washington State that's still standing. And so we get it on the market. We're on the market for some time, and finally the Olson family comes along from Bellevue, Washington, and they fall in love with it, and they buy it. And for the last 2.5 years, they've been restoring it. They restored the old cottage, the 1949 cottage that the Hansons finished and lived in for a while, I think. And then they restored a lot of the old house. They've turned the old granary into a wood shop, and they cleaned up the property. And they've just enjoyed spending their weekends up here and lovingly do it. Now they're ready for the next person to own it. It would be a great, it would be a great property for somebody that wants to do weddings or a farm to table. There's this 2,000 square foot chicken coop that could be turned into a restaurant, or it could be turned into a place for wedding families to stay at, while they're doing a wedding on the property. Like you mentioned, the views are incredible. You look right down the Strait of Juan de Fuca from up there. It's right smack. Oh, what happened? I forgot. Back in the 60s, the Hanson family decided to sell off the majority of the property all around them 360 degrees, and it became the plat of Sierra, or the Sierra Clubhouse development, which now has a swimming pool and a clubhouse and probably about 500 or so lots. Got its own water system and everything. But right in the middle of this, which most people don't know, is a 5-acre rectangle that comprises the remains of the old Libbey Ranch. And even though it's in the middle of Sierra, it's not part of the Sierra structure, so it's not part of their covenants. But they did wisely, when they did this, give themselves a right to the pool, and they do have 2 water shares, one of them that they purchased recently. So it's a cool place. It's a cool story, and that's the history of Whidbey Island.
It's a history of Whidbey Island, and also the history of this wonderful Libbey Ranch home. So as you mentioned, Dad, it's just this beautiful, if you were to look at a plat map, top-down view, you've got this large development, this Sierra neighborhood lot with its own HOA and the swimming pool, beach access. It's just north of Fort Eby State Park, and so lots of really cool history there, and neat trails to run or bike or walk, and some ponds to fish and things like that. So just a really cool part of Whidbey Island. But right in the center of this plot, as you mentioned, just this 5-acre parcel, it's got the ranch house, it's got this granary, the shop, this chicken coop. That when you say chicken coop, my mind goes to chicken fencing, but it's not. It's a full-on structure, commercial structure that, like you said, could be renovated into some space. And then there's a guest cottage. There's whole nother house, guest cottage there as well.
They've used it recently as a VRBO type place and have gotten rave reviews.
Yeah,
it's all brand new inside.
There's a well
on the property. There's a dug well, there were
like the original.
Yeah, there was a dug well. There's also a drilled well. Neither of those are used right now.
But they could be if somebody wanted to potentially. I mean, you'd have to do some work to reopen them.
I don't know the legality of that, because they were perfectly legal when they were used at the time. But then when the plat of Sierra happened, people began putting in septic systems near these wells, and that renders a well unusable at that point.
So they've got the 2 water shares as part of the community anyway.
They're hooked into the Sierra water system, so that's where their water comes from.
And not just 1, but 2. So they could potentially build more, or is that what they've got is what they can build?
No, so the land, it's 5 acres, and because they got the second water share, and because the cottage has always been a separate mailing address.
Separate tax parcel and everything, right?
Nope. It's a one tax parcel.
But separate mailing address?
Yeah, but the county has this rule that if an original tax parcel had 2 separate mailing addresses on it, which is very uncommon, but I sold one of these recently on Miller Road, which also had 2...
One tax parcel, but 2 separate addresses. 2
separate homes on it. They will allow you to subdivide them, or short. It's called a short plat. You can do that if you go through the process. So we had gone through the process about 2.5 years ago, and so that was available back then. We think it's still available, but that's for the buyer to discover with the county.
Okay. But they've both got water. I mean, the 2 separate water shells, so they could potentially build a whole nother home.
They could subdivide the northern third of this property with a cottage, and then use the cottage as a guest house and build a regular house there with a really nice view.
Yeah.
And of course, they have to expand the second septic system and all that stuff.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. So there's some possibilities there for expansion. It's got a tennis court, as you mentioned,
which has now been modified so that it's also got a pickleball court, because that's the new thing now.
Of course, it has a pickleball, and it's got the old poplar tree.
The old poplar tree from Captain Roeder.
Yeah.
Yep, which is
Yeah.
massively huge.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's got fruit trees. The Olsons have built a fenced-in garden to keep the deer out because there's deer everywhere. The old ranch house, thanks to your brothers, has a brand new 3-bedroom septic system. When they were working for Reed Tasha, they put in about 2.5 years ago. The old cottage has its own septic system.
Yeah. So just a neat location, as mentioned, across from the state park, Fort Eby and beach access. And, so Libby Road, they were going to dig through there. Yeah.
Yeah, so Howard Grasser, again, before he passed away, I went over to his house one day and just begged him to tell me stories. So he told me the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers visited Whidbey Island when he was a kid, and they did a survey down what we call Libby Road, and they did soundings. They drilled down to try to find bedrock or whatever, see what they were looking for. They did soundings, drilled soundings all the way down what is today called Libby Road, but back then he said they called it the old Canal Road because the Army Corps of Engineers had a plan to cut a canal from what we call Libby's Landing on the elbow of Whidbey Island all the way through to Penn Cove. And that would allow the ships coming down the Skagit River. They could send lumber down from the Cascades down the Skagit River, collect it in Penn Cove, and then put it on ships, mill it there at Grasser's Lagoon. There used to be a sawmill, and there were other sawmills, probably in LaConner and Mount Vernon, Burlington. There was sawmills everywhere. They would mill boards, put them on ships, take them through the canal, and then straight out the straits and then down to San Francisco and California and stuff like that. It would save them from having to go north through the treacherous Deception Pass or south all the way around the bottom of the island to get back up again.
Right.
But they elected never to build a canal there. They were going to build a canal at what we call Lake Hancock, Greenbank Farm to Holmes Harbor.
Cove area?
No, to Holmes Harbor. So they were going to go from Lake Hancock. They were going to punch through. So there was a plan at one time to put a canal through there, and they didn't do that either. So, yeah, that was called the Old Canal Road, then later named Libby Road after the Libby family.
Yeah, it's a real skinny stretch of our island where Penn Cove comes in, and then, the elbow of would be on the outside there down Libby Road. So that leads to this old ranch house.
Do you know where Sunshine Drip Cafe is in Coupeville?
In Coupeville? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if you come off the highway, turn left at the light and go north on North Main, and you go past Sunshine Drip, the next structure on your left is Samuel Libby's son's house, the old Joseph Libby house, where he got married, and that's Joseph Barstow Libby. I think that's his house, and that recently has been restored. Somebody bought that a few years ago and restored it beautifully. So.
Cool. Awesome. Well, excellent expose into the Libbey Ranch home and some wonderful history of Whidbey Island for those that aren't familiar or those that have lived here and wanted to learn more. And if there's any questions about this beautiful listing in particular from a real estate perspective, Clay, how can they reach you?
Well, what they need to know, Tim, is that your dad doesn't do dual agency. So what does that mean? In many states, dual agency is outlawed.
Rightly so.
For a reason, but in Washington State, for some bad reason, in my opinion, it's allowed. And what dual agency is, if a real estate agent represents a buyer and a seller on the same property at the same time. So think of a lawyer representing a husband and a wife in a divorce trial. So it's when you have dual agency, the agent is earning the commission from the buyer and from the seller, both sides, and they're supposed to represent both. I don't think it's ethical personally, because your first relationship with that particular property is always with the seller. So you get the listing from the seller, and what do you tell the seller? I'm going to do everything I can to help you get top dollar for this house.
Right.
And what do you do when you get a buyer? You tell the buyer, look, buyer, I'm going to represent you. I'm going to do everything I can to help you get that house for the least amount of money.
Right.
So how do you reconcile those two conflicting
as a dual agent, yeah.
goals? So it is possible. It is legal. I'm not saying everybody that practices it is unethical. I just think the whole practice is unethical. And I wish they would outlaw it in Washington State. So I don't do it. I tried it once 21 years ago. I didn't feel good the next day. And so I said, I'll never do that again. So my advice is if anybody out there is interested in looking at the old Libby house with the maybe the thought that they might want to buy it and be the next owner, talk to you. You're a licensed real estate agent, and ask them to set up the showing with you, and you can take them around. And then if they want to make an offer, they would make the offer through you.
All right. Well, that works as well. It is a beautiful place. I saw it a couple of years ago as well when you first listed it. So, and that was before all the remodels. So it's definitely come a long ways, which is just incredible what the Olson family has done. And as you mentioned, my brothers Ben and Seth put in their new septic system a couple of years ago, and so they've got all that. So. Thank you for all of this wonderful information. Thank you to the listeners for tuning in to a special edition of the Anna Vivo podcast, and on this listing in particular, but also just on Whidbey Island and the cool history. Even when this property goes off the market, it's still a neat piece of Whidbey Island history that, Lord willing, will be here for a long time, and just some more delving into the past of Coopville and Whidbey Island as at large. So, any last finishing remarks here?
One little anecdotal story. So remember the Smith Island Lighthouse and the family, the Joseph Barstow, Libby said he would play with the Smith Island kids.
Yeah.
So in 1858, the lighthouse was built. When it was built 200 feet away from the western bluff of Smith Island, which looks right down the throat of the Strait of Juan de Fuca.
Mm.
And but in 1958, 100 years later, the bluff had eroded 200 feet to the back door of the lighthouse.
2 feet a year.
2 feet a year. So the Coast Guard said it's unsafe to live here anymore. So they ran a cable from the Naval Air Station Whidbey about 6 or 7 miles underwater out to Smith Island, and they automated the lighthouse.
Mm.
And they took the family off of the island. So there was no family living out there. After 100 years, I'm guessing 10 or 12 families lived out there. After 100 years, there were no longer families living out there. That was in 1958. In 1998, 40 years later, the bluff eroded through the lighthouse foundation, and the lighthouse fell to the beach.
Mm.
And in 1999, I got permission from the U.S. Coast Guard and the National Wildlife Refuge to go out there with a couple friends in a boat and salvage 143 bricks from the beach, from the old lighthouse that had been in the lighthouse. And we brought those to my house. We let them dry out because some of them were under salt water for a while. And then in 2005, I had a mason take these bricks and build them into the hearth of our fireplace.
Yeah.
So there's this connection where these kids that lived inside these bricks were playing with the Libby kids back in 1870. It's just kind of cool.
And now your kids are sitting on those same bricks to warm their buns in the fireplace.
Yeah, yep.
And you yourself.
In the hearth, the mantle in our hearth is from the old elm tree on the Grasser property.
Straight across from Madrone.
One of the limbs had gotten cut off, and so we fashioned that into the mantle, and that elm tree came around the horn with Captain Roeder, and who also planted the poplar tree on the old Libby property.
And before you knew all of this, you collected and put that together, and then became the agent of this listing and tied all these pieces of history together.
Yeah.
And and listed it once and doing it again, and the Lord works in miraculous ways. So that's a pretty cool conclusion of the story. So all right, well, thank you, sir, for being on the air with me today. Appreciate it as always. And as my kids would say,
thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Ana Vivo podcast. We welcome your feedback and ideas. You can learn more about us by simply Googling the word Ana Vivo. This podcast is supported by listeners like you. I am a licensed real estate broker with Compass Real Estate and a nationwide real estate matchmaker. We consult with you for free, find and vet the right real estate professional that specializes in the area and niche you need, are paid by that professional, and they get clients like yourself who want and need their unique specialty or winning track record. If you or someone you know is in the market to buy or sell real estate anywhere in the U.S., don't simply web search the highest paying advertiser. Let us use our licensed experience to find and vet the real and best professional for you. It costs you nothing but a phone call or email with me, and has saved my clients financially and emotionally. I'd be honored to serve, and you can reach me direct by email at tim.c.miller@outlook.com. And as always, to God be the glory.